I remember the day it all started, February 11th, 1958. The studio was buzzing and everyone was excited. I walked in, ready to lay down a new track called Danny. It was supposed to be the title song for the movie, but something just didn't feel right. I sang it well enough, but the song didn't mesh with the rest of the soundtrack. It was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The horns were missing, and the lyrics seemed to tell a different story about the character Danny in the book, not the one in the movie. It was a bit of a letdown, but we recorded it anyway. Little did I know it would be shelved for 20 years. The next song, Steadfast, Loyal, and True, was a different story. I sang it in the movie when my character was asked to perform his school song. It was a short, forgettable tune, but it made it onto the album. I guess they needed something to fill the gaps. It wasn't my best work, but it was part of the package. But despite these hiccups, King Creole was a turning point for me. I showed people I could do more than just rock and roll. I could act. The critics were surprised. Some even said I was as good as Marlon Brando. Sure, not everyone loved it. Some called it unpleasant and unlikable. But I knew I was growing as an artist. Even the New York Times had to admit, Elvis Presley can act. The UK press was a mix of praise and skepticism. One reviewer said I was an actor, while another called the film the most unattractive Presley vehicle so far. But there were bright spots. Tony Brown from Melody Maker wrote that I had talent, and even the Daily Mirror apologized for not taking me seriously before. It was a moment of validation, and I needed it, but the clock was ticking. I had to record some singles before heading off to the Army. On February 1st, 1958, I tried to record My Wish Came True again, but it just didn't work out. We ended up using the version from the Christmas album. Then we struggled with Don't Ya Think It's Time, taking 48 takes to get it right. Your Cheatin' Heart was another letdown. It should have been a country classic, but it felt flat. Finally, we recorded Wear My Ring Around Your Neck. It was a bit silly, but it became a hit. The session was a mess, and it felt like the end of an era. My band and I wouldn't record together like this again for a long time. I was heading off to the Army, and Steve Scholes, my producer, was worried. He knew I was about to be away for 2 years, and we needed more material. By June 10th, 1958, I was already in the Army, but we had one more session. The first song, I Need Your Love Tonight, was silly, but I made it work. I embraced the sound more than the lyrics. A Big Hunk O' Love was even better. The band and I were on fire, and it had a Jerry Lee Lewis feel. Ain't That Loving You Baby was a solid blues rocker, but for some reason it wasn't released until later. A Fool Such As I was a country hit, and we nailed it. I Got Stung was the last song, and it was a wild, hard rock number. The lyrics were about a bee, but who cared? It was all about the sound. For the next 2 years, I didn't record in a studio, but I didn't stop making music. I made private recordings at friends' houses, and even in Germany. I played songs like Tomorrow Night and Just a Closer Walk with Thee. I experimented with different styles, playing the piano and guitar, and I even tried out The Fool and Soldier Boy. These songs would come back to me later, but for now, I was just having fun. The Army was a new chapter, but the music was always with me. I was back in the studio on March 20th, 1960, just a few weeks after I got out of the Army. I had a lot of new ideas and a voice that had grown stronger and more flexible. I was excited to see what I could do with my new sound. The first song we worked on was Make Me Know It, a solid mid-tempo rocker by Otis Blackwell, who had written hits like Don't Be Cruel. My voice had changed a lot, and it was obvious from the first note. It was smoother and more mature, but we still managed to rock it without the wild abandon I used to have. Next, we recorded Soldier Boy, a song I had played around with while in Germany. It was a doo-wop number, and my voice was velvety and powerful. I took my time with the lyrics, and it felt good to sing something that showed how much I had grown. Stuck on You was supposed to be the first single, but I wasn't really into it. It felt like a rehash of the old stuff, and I wanted to show my fans that I had evolved. Still, it became a hit, even though it didn't really capture the new me. Fame and Fortune was a game changer. My voice was stronger and purer, and I could switch between different sounds effortlessly. The song was a doo-wop classic, and I felt like I was telling a story with my voice. A mess of blues brought back some of the edginess from the 50s, but my voice was more plaintive now. The Jordanaires provided a great backing, and the song became a hit in the UK. It Feels So Right was a slow, bluesy number that showed how much I had matured. I didn't need to rasp and holler. I could seduce my listeners with a smoother, sexier sound. The session went better than I could have hoped, and the singles, Stuck on You and Fame and Fortune, hit the stores a week later. Billboard said I was back and as hot as ever. A few days later, on March 26th, I appeared on Frank Sinatra's TV show, Welcome Home, Elvis. It was nerve-wracking, especially since I hadn't been on TV in over 3 years. I performed Stuck on You and Fame and Fortune, and then did a duet with Sinatra. It was a bit awkward, and I had trouble with the lyrics, but it all went off without a major hitch. The critics weren't too kind, but I was just glad to be back. On April 3rd, I went back to the studio, and we recorded 12 amazing tracks in one night. It was a whirlwind, and we ended up with 2 of my most memorable hits. I was amazed at how much I had grown as a singer, and I was ready to take on whatever came next. I started the night off by singing Peggy Lee's Fever. It was a jazz song, and not something I usually went for, but it worked well for me. I slowed it down a bit and sang it in a way that was super smooth and sultry. The recording was in living stereo, which made it sound really clear and rich. Next, I tackled a blues song called Like a Baby. It was written by Jesse Stone, who also wrote Money Honey. I took inspiration from the versions done by Vicki Nelson and Tony Arden. Nelson's version was grittier, and Arden's was a mix of different styles, but I wanted to keep it simple and make it sound like a real blues song. I felt really confident and showed off my new, mature voice that I had been working on while in the Army. I could switch from deep to high notes easily, and it felt natural. Then I sang It's Now or Never, which had new lyrics to the Italian song O Sole Mio. I had played around with a similar song called There's No Tomorrow while I was in Germany. This song was a big challenge because it had a wide range of notes. But I controlled my voice well, and I could go from singing really loud to whispering, all in the same song. At the end, I sang like my hero, Mario Lanza. People noticed the difference in my voice and said it had a Neapolitan flavor. Some loved it, while others thought I was moving away from my rock and roll roots. After a break, I sang The Girl of My Best Friend. This was a pop song, and it didn't feel as natural for me as my usual stuff, but I still gave it my all and made it work. The lyrics felt more like they were for a teenager, but I sang it convincingly. Surprisingly, it became a top 10 hit in the UK 16 years later. I Gotta Know was another pop song, but it was more fun and catchy. The arrangement was great, and the Jordanaires added a lot to the song. It was released as the B-side to Are You Lonesome Tonight, but I think it could have been a hit on its own. Dirty Dirty Feeling was a bit of a letdown. It was a Labor and Stoller song, but it didn't have much structure and was just verse after verse. I tried my best, but it ended up being just okay and not one of my best. Thrill of Your Love was different. I mixed gospel with a love song, and it worked really well. I sang it beautifully, and Floyd Kramer's piano added a bluesy gospel feel. If I had more time to work on it, it could have been even better, but it was still a great song. I then sang Such a Night, a song that Johnny Ray made famous. My version was more restrained compared to Ray's, which was very suggestive. I could tell that my style had changed since I was in the Army, but it was still a good and fun performance. Are You Lonesome Tonight was a big deal. It was an old waltz that Colonel Parker suggested. I had tried similar songs before, but I never nailed them until this one. I sang it with a more mature and confident voice, and the recitation part wasn't awkward at all. This song became one of my classics, and I performed it many times over the years. The Girl Next Door Went a Walkin' was a weak song, but I sang it well. It was a promise to my guitarist Scotty Moore, but it didn't have much energy. I also sang I Will Be Home Again with my friend Charlie Hodge. We met in the Army and became close. The song was more pop than my usual stuff, but our voices blended well together. Finally, I sang Reconsider Baby, a blues song. I had played around with it, during the $1 Million Quartet session. The sax solo by Boots Randolph was amazing, and I felt like I really nailed the blues sound. It was a perfect end to the session. The album Elvis is Back was a big success. I had a new, mature voice, and the band and songs were diverse. The album showed that I could do more than just rock and roll. Some people loved it, but others thought I had lost some of my early energy. It was a new chapter for me, and I was excited to see where it would take me. When I first went to Hollywood, it was to star in the Western Love Me Tender for 20th Century Fox. 4 years later, I found myself back at the same studio, but this time for a different Western called Flaming Star. Directed by Don Siegel, this movie is a lot more serious and has become quite respected over the years. People often say it's my best acting performance, and while that might be up for debate, I did my best to make it a good one. Don Siegel, the director, was really helpful. He said I was sensitive and had good acting abilities, but I was also pretty insecure. Once he helped me relax, I think I did a decent job. The cast was great too, with Barbara Eden, Steve Forrest, and Dolores Del Rio, who was back on the big screen after acting in Mexican movies for a while. When the movie came out, the reviews were mixed. A.H. Weiler called it a sturdy but unpretentious Western, and said I looked like a believable young Native American because of the makeup and the color cameras. He thought the movie was neat and satisfying, even if it wasn't electrifying. The Motion Picture Daily said I did better in this role than in my earlier dramatic parts, and praised Dolores Del Rio's performance too. In the UK, The Times said I gave a satisfactory contribution to a movie that was visually impressive. But the monthly film bulletin was less impressed with the movie overall. They thought it tried to be a Greek tragedy, but never really got beyond a comic strip drama. They criticized the script for having a lot of overly dramatic Native American dialogue and outdated views on being a half-breed. However, they did say I had a brooding presence that worked well for the character. For the movie, they tried to include some songs, just like in Love Me Tender, but 2 of the 4 songs we recorded ended up being cut after test screenings. One of them was Summer Kisses, Winter Tears, which was supposed to be sung to a group of Native Americans around a campfire. It made people laugh, which wasn't good for a movie trying to deal with serious issues. The song was released later on an EP, and while I sang it well, it's not exactly the most exciting song I've ever done. Despite the mixed reviews, Flaming Star has stood the test of time and is now seen as a more serious and well-made film. It was a different kind of role for me, and I learned a lot from working with Don Siegel and the cast. It showed that I could do more than just rock and roll, and that I could handle a dramatic role. I remember when I got out of the Army in 1960, things were different. Before, I was this controversial guy, all over the news and TV. But after serving, people started seeing me differently. Hedda Hopper, a famous writer, even wrote that I was a good soldier, and now people respected me more. She said I was no great admirer of him until the day his colonel told me, "I wish we had 10,000 soldiers just like him." Nancy Anderson, another writer, said my voice was even better and more mature. She noticed that I was singing more blues and gospel, and that I had a group of friends who were always with me, helping me stay grounded. It was a big change from the wild days before the Army. One of the biggest moments that year was when I recorded my first full gospel album, His Hand in Mine. It was a long night in the studio, but it felt right. The album had a mix of upbeat and serious songs. The title song, His Hand in Mine, was inspired by a group called the Statesmen, but I made it my own. I changed the dynamics and even sang some parts in a whisper. It was a different me, more mature and in control. I'm Gonna Walk Dem Golden Stairs was another standout. I sang it with the Jordanaires and we blended our voices together. It felt like we were all part of the same group. In My Father's House was a ballad where I got to show off my range, but I also let my friends have their moments. Milky White Way was a fun one where I mixed in some blues and doo-wop. It was like a 2-minute masterpiece. Known Only to Him was a waltz, and I used my upper register to make it special. I Believe in the Man in the Sky had a quick tempo and a swing feel. It was a different sound from the 1957 gospel EP. Joshua Fit the Battle was an upbeat traditional spiritual, and I sang it with a natural swing. He Knows Just What I Need was a more somber ballad, and it had a feel similar to Johnny Cash's gospel music. Swing Down Sweet Chariot and Mansion Over the Hilltop were both good, but they didn't have the magic of the other songs. If We Never Meet Again was a sweet ballad, and Working on the Building was the weakest of the bunch, but it closed the album. The album was a big deal. Billboard called it a fascinating set of performances, and it showed that I was more than just a teen idol. It was a serious, mature artistic statement. The packaging didn't focus on my pictures. Instead, it had detailed liner notes explaining why this music meant so much to me. We also recorded Crying in the Chapel that night. It was a pop song with an inspirational theme, and it didn't fit the album's sound, so it wasn't released until years later. But it became a hit and is one of my best-loved songs. 1960 was a year of change. I was no longer just the wild rock and roller. I was a respected artist, and my music was reaching a whole new audience. In the middle of my recording session, I sang Surrender, which was meant to be a follow-up to It's Now or Never. Surrender was based on Torna a Sorrento, and even though I sang it well, it didn't have the same depth as It's Now or Never. I had some trouble hitting the high notes, but we managed to get it right. The song became a hit, reaching #1, but it felt a bit like we were just repeating a formula that worked before. Later that year, in the fall, I made some private recordings. Fans knew about these tapes since 1997, when Ernst Jorgensen wrote about them in his book. In 1999, some of the songs were finally released on 2CD, the home recordings, and in a private moment. The sound quality was better than the recordings from the year before, but most of the songs were just snippets. It was fun to sing a mix of different stuff, like Make Believe from Showboat and Lottie Miss Claudie. I even sang a short version of Beyond the Reef, which I would record again in 1966, and a nice half version of She Wears My Ring, which ended up sounding better than the studio version I did years later. One of the highlights was me playing the piano and singing If I Loved You from Carousel, which I did again in 1966. A week after recording the gospel album, His Hand in Mine, I went back to the studio to record the soundtrack for my next movie, Wild in the Country. The movie was about a troubled young writer, and it had a good cast, including Hope Lange, Tuesday Weld, and John Ireland. But something went wrong. The script was written by Clifford Odets, who is known for Golden Boy, but the dialogue was full of cliches. The director, Philip Dunn, was good at writing but not so much at directing, and he couldn't bring the best out of me. I told Variety I was worried about the dramatic parts, but even though I was nervous, I did my best. The critics didn't like the movie. Bosley Crowther from the New York Times called it seamy, sentimental nonsense, and even made a comment about my weight, saying I looked waxy and flabby. The songs for the soundtrack were better than the movie. I Slipped, I Stumbled, I Fell was the only rock song and ended up on my next album, Something for Everybody. It wasn't bad, but it felt a bit undercooked. Lonely Man was a beautiful ballad with a western feel, thanks to the accordion. The solo version, which came out much later, is even better because it's just me and an acoustic guitar. In My Way and Forget Me Never were also ballads, and they had a simple, intimate feel. In My Way was especially stark, and the lyrics could be about the end of a relationship or something sadder. These songs showed a different side of me, more like the private recordings, and it was nice to sing without all the extra stuff. The title song, Wild in the Country, was a bit of a letdown. The Jordanaires' backing didn't work well with my delicate singing, and it didn't fit the mood of the movie. The song did well in the UK, reaching #4, but it was a bit of a disappointment. 1960 was a big year for me. I had 3 hit singles, a successful movie and soundtrack, and a Grammy nomination. I even got praise from famous directors like George Cukor. In an interview, I talked about my goals as an actor and said I wanted to focus on acting, even though I didn't have time for acting lessons. I also said rock and roll wasn't dead, but I admitted that I might have lost some of my younger fans because of the Army. My manager, Colonel Parker, wanted to make sure I had something for older fans too. In March 1961, I went back to the studio to record my next album, Something for Everybody. The album had ballads on one side and up-tempo songs on the other. It was a mix of different styles, but it felt like I was trying to appeal to everyone. The songs were good, but they didn't have the same edge as the ones from Elvis is Back. I was still singing well, but I could feel that something was changing. I remember the first time I heard There's Always Me by Don Robertson. It opened the album, and wow, it was a powerful start. The song was different from anything Elvis had done before. The piano at the beginning was so simple, but it set the mood perfectly. As the song went on, you could hear Elvis's voice change. He started off quiet and shy, but by the middle, he was singing with more strength and confidence. Then he went back to a softer style, building up to an amazing climax. The way the song ended was perfect, not overdone like it could have been. It was like watching a character grow and change in just a few minutes. It's a shame the rest of the album didn't match this level of excitement, and I wish all his movies were this good. The next song, Give Me the Right, was a bit of a letdown. It had a nice bluesy feel and Millie Kirkham's beautiful soprano, but it felt like more of the same stuff Elvis had done before. It was smooth and professional, but it didn't have that new or exciting feel like There's Always Me. It seemed like Elvis was trying not to offend older fans, but it just felt a bit too safe and not as dynamic as his earlier work. I'm Coming Home was a bit of a throwback to the early 1960s sound. It had a cool, tight rhythm, and the band really got to show off during the instrumental. The song was fun, but it was clear that Elvis was sticking to a formula that worked but wasn't pushing any boundaries. In Your Arms was another song that felt like a repeat of the past. It was a good fit for Elvis, but it lacked the raw energy of his earlier stuff. It was clean and polished, but it didn't have the same spark. It was almost like a second-hand version of what he had done before. Put the Blame on Me was a breath of fresh air. It had a bluesy feel, and the organ added a cool touch. The song could have used a bit more edge, but it was still really good. It reminded me of the early 1960s sound, and it was one of the better tracks on the album. Judy was one of the worst songs on the album. It just didn't fit Elvis at all. The melody was awkward, and the band didn't seem to be on the same page. It was a real letdown after Put the Blame on Me. I Want You With Me was a highlight. It was one of the few songs that showed the old Elvis. The arrangement was cleaner, and Elvis really dug into the song. It was a reminder of why he was so great in the first place. The rest of the album felt like a watered-down version of Elvis is Back. The rockers didn't have the same energy, and the ballads weren't as convincing. It was slick and professional, but it lacked the rawness and joy that made Elvis's best work so special. One reviewer said it best: the ballads are tender without the usual groans, and the rhythm side is a bit tamer than before. It was trying to be something for everyone, but it ended up being in a musical no man's land. Moving on to Blue Hawaii, the movie, it was a bit of a mixed bag. A lot of people blame it for the string of travelogue and beach movies that followed, but I think it was a good fit for Elvis at the time. He wasn't required to act beyond his capabilities, and the film and soundtrack were polite enough to keep him in the spotlight as an all-around entertainer. The Variety review said it restored Elvis to his natural screen element, and the Times in the UK noted that his style had sobered and matured. The soundtrack was a mix of well-known Hawaiian songs, traditional numbers, and new material. Hawaiian Sunset was a standout. It was arranged in a higher key, and Elvis's softer tone really shone. The song was effective, and his vibrato was wider than usual, but he kept it in check. Island of Love wasn't as strong. The song itself wasn't great, and the instrumental section felt unfinished. It was a bit strange, and it made me wonder why they didn't just use older songs that were already popular. Beach Boy Blues was a fun, fake blues with clever wordplay. Elvis didn't take it too seriously, but he still enjoyed singing the blues elements. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it did its job. Slisson Sand was a bit of a watered-down rock and roll song. It was inoffensive and fun, but it wasn't anything special. Elvis took it in good humor, and it was a nice, light-hearted track. Ito Eats was a silly little calypso number that didn't really add much to the film or the album. It was odd that they spent so much time on it, but it just slowed things down. Aloha-O was a traditional Hawaiian song, and Elvis sang it well. It could have been used more in the film to give it a more authentic feel, but the arrangement was a bit thin. Almost Always True was a fun, upbeat number based on a French children's song. The arrangement was amusing, and Boots Randolph's solos were fantastic. It was a quirky addition to the album and the film. Overall, Blue Hawaii was a good fit for Elvis, and the soundtrack had its moments. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was a pleasant and enjoyable experience. The songs of Blue Hawaii were a mixed bag, but the ones that stood out made the album worth it. No More was based on an old Spanish tune, La Paloma, and Elvis's powerful voice really shone, especially at the end with that smooth transition to a higher, more powerful note. Kuyu I Po felt like an old Hawaiian song, even though it was new. I liked how simple and effective it was, and it was cool to see how Elvis brought it back years later. Can't Help Falling in Love became one of Elvis's best songs, and it was inspired by an 18th century French melody, Plaisir d'amour. The original recording was amazing, with Elvis's vocals hitting both powerful and intimate notes, and the backing by the Jordanaires was perfect. When he brought it back for the 1968 TV special and his concerts, it always felt fresh and moving. On the flip side, Rock a Hula Baby was a fun, energetic song that felt like a beach party in the studio. Even though it was marketed as a twist single, it was just a good, catchy tune that made people want to dance. Some songs like Moonlight Swim and Steppin' Out of Line were just not that great. Moonlight Swim was so bad it was memorable for all the wrong reasons, and Steppin' Out of Line had an awkward rhythm and uninspired lyrics. I don't know why they even included it in the album. It was cut from the film for a reason. Blue Hawaii and the Hawaiian Wedding Song were perfect for the album. They showed how beautiful Elvis's voice had become, and he seemed to be focusing more on how rich and smooth he could make it sound. The way he hit the final note in Blue Hawaii was impressive, and the Hawaiian Wedding Song was another example of his vocal control. The film itself got good reviews. The New York Times said it was painless to watch, and the Valley News praised the singing and dancing, even if the plot was thin. Overall, Blue Hawaii was a fun, light-hearted movie with some great music, and it showed that Elvis could still create something special even in a less serious context. In March 1961, I gave a live performance at Pearl Harbor. The sound wasn't great, but it was a powerful show. I was more into rock and roll on stage, and it was a different side of me compared to the sweet, crooning sound I was using in the studio. The review in the Honolulu Advertiser was very positive, saying I was more handsome and appealing in person than in my records or movies. It was a reminder of what I could do if I focused more on live performances. In June, I recorded a new single with Little Sister, and Marie's the name of his latest flame. Little Sister had a tough, edgy sound that could have kept me relevant in the changing music scene. His latest flame was softer, but still had a good sound. The single did well, but it didn't reach the top spot in America, which was a bit disappointing. The other songs from that session, like Kiss Me Quick and I'm Yours, were decent but lacked the emotional impact of the single sides. That's Someone You Never Forget was the best of the bunch, a ballad that showed I could still deliver when given a song I cared about. In July, I recorded for the film Follow That Dream. The songs were pleasant but not groundbreaking. Follow That Dream was an upbeat, predictable song, but it was fun and fit the movie well. It was a different kind of project, more of a comedy drama, and the songs did what they needed to without trying to be more than that. By the end of 1961, I was still capable of making great music, but the direction of my career was starting to shift. The movies were taking over, and I was recording more pop songs than the rock and roll that had made me famous. It was a time of change, but I was still giving it my all, and I hoped that the good songs would keep coming.